Matters of fact. Facts matter. Tom Wegener, a German radio journalist, and Wolfram Hartmann, a Namibian historian, talk about important aspects of Namibia's controversial and painful colonial past.
Hello and welcome to the second part of our Matters of Fact, Facts Matter podcast on the OvaHerero genocide. In this section of our conversation, we move beyond what happened and turn to how it is remembered, contested and interpreted. Why does the genocide still matter so profoundly in Namibia today? How do we deal with sources produced largely by perpetrators? What strategies are used to minimize or deny genocidal intent? And why do they persist? And how come did OvaHerero survive when marked for annihilation? We reflect on these thorny issues, not to end the discussion, but to hone, to animate the quest to come to terms with this most injurious past. This is a reflection on history, yes, but it is also reflecting on power, memory, and the unfinished work of justice, but treated especially as an opportunity for true reconciliation in Namibia. It is a prerequisite for healing. Was sich begegnet, darf heilen.
All right, Tom, one at a time. Why is the OvaHerero and Nama genocide still such a burning question? Why is it considered such overarchingly important issue in and for Namibia, some 120 years after it played out in German colonial Southwest Africa? A few important points, not exhaustingly though, warrant consideration. What we still see. The destruction brought by German colonialism with its genocidal policies between 1904 and 1908, roughly, still has a bearing on OvaHerero and Nama, and as such on all Namibians, psychologically, mentally, socially, economic. Namibia's wealth distribution being still among the most unequal globally, there still being no conciliation, the events still evoking strong emotional reactions. There is no sustainable knowledge base, and an unbelievable ignorance and cluelessness about the events under consideration prevails. Very few people really know what happened factually, believe it or not, whereas very many people have strong opinions on the issues, unfounded of course, and based on rumor and allegation, well, quite deplorable. Stories abounding, a sad and deplorable, lamentable state indeed. Add to this the hyperbole, the moral posturing and virtue signaling, even self-aggrandizement, catering to the vanities of academics and politicians, often being about nothing more than a feel-good only for activists, and then not to forget plain denial of what played out in Uazuvara from mid-August 1904. None of this does justice to the horrid events and agony, the suffering and distress of 1904 and the following years, as inflicted by the German colonial military, and still remembered and present on many levels, physical, mental, psychological, as laid out in the first part of this episode. Clearly, this does not acknowledge, it disrespects the pain and grief of OvaHerero and Nama, and arguably has a bearing on even the descendants of the perpetrators. All of this is insufferable and unbearable for a Namibianist historian, a professional historian whose main aim is to understand the events as they unfolded, to dissect received wisdom, to apply the tools of his trade, and who believes in the conciliatory function of good historical craftsmanship. One of the issues that have come up quite strongly in our chronological rendering of the events, a really important question, is about the sources available for a thorough evaluation of this catastrophe in the history of OvaHerero and of course Nama. This is definitely an important issue, an issue that needs to be reflected on at all times as we attempt to research, write and present colonial history. One could talk at length and ad nauseum, yet a short and precise answer is what is called for in this instance. Two different kinds of sources are readily available for the history of the colonial encounter. Firstly, source material left by the colonizer, and secondly, source material available as oral history. Colonial sources are, as a rule, written sources. They are, in essence, the sources of the victor and will contain only that side of the story. In our case, we have reports, letters, policy documents, official histories, diaries, and so forth. Oral sources are the orally cultivated bodies of knowledge transmitted from generation to generation and reflecting the experience of the colonized. Colonial sources have to be treated with great caution, as they will inevitably reflect the biases characterizing contemporary concerns. They cannot be taken at face value and need to be handled with great professional discretion, circumspection, skills, methodology, source critique in particular, that professional historians should bring to rigorously and diligently to this history, which, in the Namibian case, is most often not the case, sadly. Think, for instance, of the colonial official history of the OvaHerero and Nama Wars, collated and authored by the Große Generalstab in Berlin, as from 1906, without methodological skills and source-critical considerations by military men who had no knowledge of the situation on the ground. Their motivation was, well, to celebrate German honor. Oral history. Think grandmothers, sages and storytellers. The official history narrators is quite as problematic, even while it is often taken to be the magic wand. Just asking, how can a body of historical knowledge reflecting experienced pain, suffering, be orally transmitted on new in every generation? How can this not be subject to the narrator's personal, psychological, social, political, and mental disposition and concerns at the time of narration and recording? How can such oral accounting not be subject to what an audience makes of it? What the public wants to hear, depending on contemporary discussions and concerns. Problems. Uazuvara Kapombo Katjivena, a witness and active participant of Namibia's last 50 to 60 years, has recently published oral history as related to him by his grandmother, Mama Penee. The book's subtitle is Transcending the Genocide, oral history committed to paper and now, of course, constituting written history. At first, I approached the book skeptically with professional reservation as laid out above. But as soon as I started reading, I realized and was moved by what oral history's function in the Namibian context can be, regardless of so many inaccuracies in Kapombo's text, transcending the genocide with love and beautiful. That is what oral history can do. By way of what we said before, was sich begegnet, darf heilen, as applied to our issue here, translated as the confrontation, the encounter with the most painful and unpalatable aspects of our Namibian past can facilitate healing, can transcend the genocide. Of course, this answer is not as exhaustive as it could and should be. However, let's move on to some other concern, a thorny issue closely related to what was just expanded on. Quite some energy is spent on arguing that Tota's shoot to kill order was not genocidal. Huh? Yes, not genocidal? Well, so the argument goes, women were expressly exempted, for instance. One particular argument tries to circumvent the inconveniently incriminating fact scenario of a genocide committed. It is argued by employing a discourse analytical argument. Destruction is not annihilation. Well, quite astounding to what length some exponents of genocide denial are going. This is, weirdly enough, presented by mostly Germans, and frankly, I have not really been able to wrap my brain around this. To explain, let me quote from the first part of this issue of our podcast. This is what I said. We need to take a quick discursive side trip here to spell out the term destruction, as some problems occur translation-wise. The German term here was vernichten, to destroy. In contemporary German discourse, this word meant nothing more and nothing less than to incapacitate the enemy, to render the foe unable to continue fighting, that is, to kill the adversary's fighters or to capture his warriors as prisoners of war. In the context of European warfare, and this is how this war was fought from the Europeans, we shouldn't forget that. In this context, women and children, the old and infirm, in short the civilians, non-combatants, were spared. Well, they were living in villages, and usually wars happened outside. Of course, this was impossible in our case, as there was no meaningful difference between warriors, the military, and the civilian sphere that is among OvaHerero. The argument I'm making is that Trota's shoot-to-kill order, his genocide edict, reflects his changed approach. Total annihilation now being the ultimate strategy. So why would anybody expand mental energy on making such untenable argument? Most probably by way of speculation, actually. The genocidal truth is just too painful and inconvenient to bear and not palatable among colonialism apologists and other right-wingers. This we really have to keep in mind, even if this seems trite, banal even. Also, quite an interesting question. Why was this order afterwards never part of any deliberations? It is not even mentioned in the above used or mentioned official history, one wants to ask. An answer? Trota's order was already in 1904 and thereafter considered to be so outrageously evil, horrid, that contemporaries rather not mentioned it. It was only once genocide had been fully legally codified in the late 1940s, after Hitler's and Stalin's genocides, that Trota's edict was kind of, maybe rediscovered. Quite closely related to this is the often repeated question about OvaHerero survival. Again, often enough asked suggestively, insinuating that a genocide, the complete eradication of OvaHerero, could not have happened. This, of course, raises the question of numbers. How many, if indeed any, OvaHerero survived the German massacres? Whereas the genocide discourse suggests the complete eradication of OvaHerero from the surface of this earth, and some of the arguments forwarded in contemporary discussions are taking their cue from this, OvaHerero are, despite this, a significant and viable ethnic group with a distinctive social, cultural, and political presence in present-day Namibia. Yes, numbers-wise, we cannot really make any watertight argument, as we don't have really reliable data. Several estimations of the number of OvaHerero in southwestern Africa up until 1904 vary wildly in quantity and cannot really be used to sustain a meaningful argument. And numbers of perished OvaHerero for the years 1904 to 1907 are not really available, well, except for those from the camps. Who would have recorded fatalities during the battles, or from the battles anyway? Numbers of survivors are as unavailable, though some information can be gleaned from records of missionaries and colonial officials, the latter having recorded such information from the concentration camps in Windhoek, Okahandja, Swakopmund, and Shark Island. No systematic attempt has as yet been made, however, to collate the numeric information available, yet it is safe to say that a few thousand survived in these camps, though under precarious conditions. Missionary Kuhlmann, Rhenish Mission Society, reported just over 4,000 survivors in June 1906 from the collection camp he was running at Omburo. The Rhenish Mission Society had established so-called collection camps for destitute, fleeing, roaming, thirsty and hungry OvaHerero at Omburo, Okomitombe, Oshezongombe and Oshihenena. About these survivors we will talk in a future edition of this work. Arguably, a discussion about the numbers of surviving OvaHerero has an unfortunate tang of genocide denial and obfuscation, attempting to whitewash German colonial times in Namibia as the numbers issue crops up regularly among those trying to positively enshrine this area in our history. To wrap this up, let me reiterate what I argued in this podcast's first section. Until October, the events had been understood on the German side as a war according to European warfare tenets, also known as imperial warfare among specialists. Its prime aim being the military destruction of the adversary, not the complete eradication of the enemy. This, however, the Germans did not accomplish. Trota's shoot-to-kill order represents a change, a reversal of the strategy, a strategy that now is aimed at the indiscriminate annihilation of the foe. Giotto's vanity must have played out here, as he was certainly expecting to be honored by the Kaiser, a resounding victory being a requirement. In other words, a situation that had persisted on the ground was made official. Unofficial genocidal warfare was now officially executed genocidally, a genocide. Because, lest we forget, what had happened and was happening on the ground resembled total war, and total wars include the whole nation of OvaHerero women, children, the very young and the old infirm, not just the fighters in this case. Warfare encompassed the whole nation thus, and German military action was aimed at exactly this whole nation. In this sense, it is permissible, I'd even emphatically say legitimate, to speak of committed genocidal action. And to be sure, there's no way that this issue, the genocide, can be discussed exhaustively. We hope this episode of our work is helpful in inserting some fact-based knowledge, is conducive to understanding the many complex aspects of the debate. Also, that it contributes to toning down an often acrimonious encounter between the descendants carrying the memory of this era in their bodies and souls. This attempt at being intellectually honest, at being single-mindedly upright, is not meant to whitewash, to relativize, to make more palatable any of the issues under consideration. It is Tom's and my belief, our take on, our strategy to come to terms with the painful past. In German, was sich begegnet, darf heilen. The confrontation, the encounter with these most unpalatable aspects of this pained Namibian past allow healing, facilitate conciliation. One last vote of thanks, Tom. Thank you for facilitating this work. It would not happen without your input. It makes it sustainable, so thank you emphatically.
Yeah, that was Wolfram sharing some thoughts and reflections on the open questions from the first part of our podcast on the genocide of the OvaHerero. Wolfram, thank you very much, and to our listeners, a heartfelt thank you as well. If you find our work valuable, please share it and help us continue the conversation. We are currently working on the next episode of our podcast series. In the upcoming episode, we'll turn our attention to the concentration camps and to the continued genocidal experience of the OvaHerero and Nama communities. As always, our commitment is to present and discuss only what can be supported by solid academic research and reliable historical evidence. So, stay tuned.